Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, can you talk to us about what measures are being taken to encourage the Russians and the Chinese to remove their objection to action in the Security Council? And in that regard, as you answer that, are you, state that is, consulting with Treasury on the possibility of designating and imposing sanctions under Executive Order 13572 on Russian and Chinese entities selling weapons to Assad? Because there's a lot of media reports stating that Russian state arms dealers are continuing to supply the Assad regime with arms. At least 4 cargo ships have left a Russian port for the Syrian port of Tartus since December of this past year, carrying ammunition, sniper rifles, and a host of other armaments. Can you give us a sense both what's happening at the Security Council to move them from their present intransigence towards Security Council action, and are we considering, in the face of this weapon flow, actions under the executive order?
Senator, thanks for the question. You put your finger on a key element of any way forward in Syria, which is what's the role of Russia. I have to admit from the outset that I'm not a Russia expert. I defer to my bosses and my colleagues in the European Bureau to talk about Russian motives and things. But I want to assure you that the sort of the contact with Russia at all levels is continuing. Russia has had interest and influence in Syria for a long time, and it seems to us that Russia is not going to preserve those interests that Russia deems to be important if it basically rides the Assad Makhlouf Titanic all the way to the bottom of the Mediterranean. That this is not a very wise move for the Russians to preserve their interests. I went out with a colleague, Fred Hoff, to Moscow a couple of weeks ago at the request of the Secretary to actually start to have a pretty deep discussion with the Russians about how we see the way forward in Syria, how we see the inevitable demise of Assad. And I felt that there was a lot of discomfort in Russia about where they are. Their analysis isn't all that different from ours about how unsustainable the situation is for Bashar al-Assad inside Syria. But so far, we've been disappointed. Use stronger language about Russia's action. Even today, for example, when the Human Rights Council in Geneva passed a resolution condemning what's happening in Syria, the vote was 39-3. Who were those 3? China, Russia, and Cuba, who voted against a resolution simply on human rights grounds. We think it's time for the Security Council to act. We think it's past time for the Security Council to act. This is the type of situation in Syria that deserves Security Council action. So we're still in discussion with the Russians in an attempt to persuade them that they can be part of a solution. They can use their influence inside Syria to be part of a solution rather than continue to block. The question of arms that you raise up is a deeply disturbing one. Why are the Russians who condemn foreign interference in Syria being the ones, along with the Iranians, to actually continue to be shipping arms in Russia? But I think that for much of this, Senator, we should probably have a discussion with colleagues from other agencies in a different setting.
Well, I'm happy to have that. I just want the administration to be thinking about, if we can't get our Russian and Chinese counterparts to understand, they seem to be doubling down. At least Russia seems to be doubling down. You say they seem to be concerned or come to the same analysis that the final result will be that Assad would not stand. But however, their flow of armament almost seems to be doubling down, as well as their intransigence in the Security Council. So at some point, that executive order, if it's to have meaning, needs to be enforced. And I certainly hope that at a minimum we would do that, because stopping the flow of armaments to Assad, I think, is incredibly important. Let me ask you one other question. What is the possibility of this situation devolving into a civil war? And if so, what concerns do you have for the political and economic implications of a Syrian civil war on Syria's neighbors, specifically on Lebanon and Jordan, which will undoubtedly receive thousands of Syrian refugees?
There's already been a spillover in the neighboring countries as Syrians fleeing the violence go to neighboring countries to look for refuge. You have families in Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq that have taken in Syrian friends and relatives. There's already an impact. In Lebanon, there have been people killed across the border by Syrian forces firing across the border. There have been violations of Lebanese sovereignty by Syrian forces crossing the Lebanese border. So there's already a spillover effect, Senator, which is deplorable. And we salute those families and those countries that are hosting Syrians outside their borders. And part of what we're trying to do is to provide assistance to those host families and governments. Bashar, as Ambassador Ford said, Bashar al-Assad wants his people, wants the world to believe that if it's not for him, there's going to be a civil war. So part of this is the Bashar al-Assad propaganda machine to frighten people into believing they have no alternative but to stick with him, or they end up in civil war. So part of what the region is trying to do, the opposition is trying to do, the international community is trying to do, is to help provide that path to avoid the civil war, because all of us do recognize that it is a risk. But as Ambassador Ford said more articulately than I can possibly say, it's not a question right now of Alawites versus Sunnis. It's a question of the Assad Makhlouf mafia that has basically hijacked the entire state of Syria for 4 decades in order to enrich itself and protect itself against the Syrian people. That's what's happening right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.